Hi there, this is a follow-up to a video I posted yesterday about large group awareness training and about cults. I actually made that previous video some time ago, back in 2011 actually, but I just got around to posting it. But I've been thinking about cults a lot recently, and specifically to do with charismatic cults and the whole idea of charisma and how groups form and how kind of social structure, social organisation affects people's capacity to think rationally and affects people's interpretation of what constitutes knowledge, really. And I'm thinking here particularly about a book by someone called Janja Lalich, I think it's pronounced, which is a woman who wrote a book called Bounded Choice, where she did a PhD thesis on certain cults, and then I say she turned that thesis into a book called Bounded Choice. She was an interesting person because she was a member of an organisation called the Democratic Workers' Party here in the UK some time ago, actually. And the Democratic Workers' Party was a political organisation, basically Marxist, Leninist, kind of communist group. You know, there's quite a lot of those kind of groups around. I think it was back in the 1970s. And she was a member of this organisation. And it was quite an unusual organisation in many ways, because although it had the same basic ideological framework as a lot of socialist or communist groups, the way it actually operated socially was very different, and the way that the ideas, the ideologies, the beliefs of that group affected the people in it and the people related to those ideologies was very, very different to other kinds of groups who had the same ideological base. Excuse me. The Democratic Workers' Party, the DWP, was widely felt to be a cult, and after its eventual demise, and after Lalich wrote a paper about it specifically, it was really felt to be a cult, because they had these kind of practices, the way they operated socially with one another, the way they interacted, the kind of principles that the kind of laws and rules and ways of operating were very specific and set them apart. And as I say, Lalich, as a member of that, she analysed the way that it operated, and I guess put forward this idea that these very particular ways of operating as a group also operated in other groups which also had cult-like properties. So when she eventually wrote Bounded Choice, two case studies were the Democratic Workers' Party, which she had first-hand experience of, and Heaven's Gate, which was a suicide, religious, alien kind of cult whose members committed mass suicide a few years back, and she wrote about those. Obviously not as an insider in that group, but as a witness to how they operated. And she saw these similarities. And what she writes about in Bounded Choice, which is really interesting, is about, well, she kind of identifies 4 principles that are at work in those kind of groups. And yeah, they can be applied to other groups which aren't really cultish, but these, she says, really mark cultish behaviour out. Well, and I'll explain what those 4 things are in a minute. But what I found really interesting about that, and I've reread large parts of that book recently. What I'm finding interesting right now is that a lot of the things she's talking about have particular import for online environments. Because when she wrote that, the DWP was quite a long time before the internet, and Heaven's Gate operated just kind of at the outset of that. It wasn't operating on most people's radar, the internet. So, but I think the way that the internet works now, and the way that excuse me, social media works now particularly, has a real interesting impact on the way that these kind of cultish behaviours function. Anyway, let me just go through these principles first. She lays out these 4 principles that she says are at work in the DWP and in Heaven's Gate and in other kind of cultish organisations. Excuse me. First, she says charismatic authority, by which she means a leadership, possibly a single person, but maybe more than that, who has this thing called charisma. And I want to talk a little bit more about charisma later on, but there's certain kinds of leadership properties that she identifies, such that people trust the leader, they give relatively unquestioning authority to that leader. They're kind of in the leader's power, really, charismatic authority. The second thing is kind of faith in a transcendent belief. And by that she doesn't really mean religious, although in the case of Heaven's Gate that is kind of religious. What she means is they're an organising principle which kind of gives a story, gives a big narrative to the world, to experience. So in the case of Heaven's Gate, that big story was a kind of religious story involving aliens. In the case of the Democratic Workers' Party, that big story was the kind of Marxist interpretation of history and how power operates, and that kind of communist, Marxist, Leninist tradition. But in other kinds of cults, there's other big stories. Either way, these things are transcendent. They're stories which people give their belief to, but which essentially are acts of faith. You know, they're narratives rather than empirical theories or any of those kind of things. So that's the second thing: charismatic authority and allegiance to a transcendent belief. The third one is systems of control. So these organisations have laws, visible rules in place which legislate what people's behaviour is, which punish transgression, exclude outsiders, reward insiders, you know, organise and control people's behaviour, usually fairly transparent, systems of control. And then systems of influence, which again legislate and controls people's behaviour, but in much more subtle ways. They're not overt, they're much more tacit. So it might be to do with things like allegiances, making allegiances with people, forming friendships or withholding friendships, allowing trust or withholding trust, circulating information or denying certain people information. So people are being influenced by these systems, and their behaviour is kind of integrated within the cult, within the group, according to the way that influence is mediated. So you've got these four things which Lalek says are operating. Let me just go through this again, make sure I've got them right. Charismatic authority, belief in some kind of transcendent belief system, systems of control, systems of influence. And these things, she says, what happens to people who are subject to these kinds of things is that the capacity to make free choices is limited or bounded, as she puts it. Now I know the whole idea of free choice is slightly odd, but what she says, she means by that the feeling of making choices that we all have. We might already feel that we're fairly bounded, but in Lalek's system we're even more bounded. Everything only makes sense in terms of the relatively narrow sense-making procedures that are enacted and performed within those systems I've just described. So if you remember the Democratic Workers' Party, your capacity to choose is limited to the terms set by those four principles. If you're a member of Heaven's Gate, your capacity to make sense of the world is limited and bounded by those four principles as they operate within that social framework. Alright, so that's the idea of that. And I think it's just really fascinating. One of the things, well, I've been thinking about several things in relation to that. I did think about trying to talk about a number of kind of YouTube and online social media phenomena more generally in terms of that, because I think there are certainly ways of talking about the Atheist Plus movement, for example, in terms of those four principles. I mean, it's very, very easy. If you spend any time at all in Free Thought blogs or on the Atheist Plus forum, it's kind of glaringly obvious that there's an interpretation to be made of the way those people operate in terms of forming bounded choices by the operation of those four principles. Which isn't to say they're bad people necessarily, it's just that that's the way things evolve sometimes. So there's certainly an Atheism Plus interpretation, or analysis to be made in those terms, or antinatalism on YouTube, certainly, not so much in the wider environment, but certainly YouTube antinatalism does lend itself to a really easy interpretation of group behaviour in terms of charismatic authority, transcendent belief, systems of control and systems of influence. But having said that, I'm kind of more interested really at this point, not so much in those groups themselves, but the way that social media, particularly something like YouTube, but blogging more generally, has, well, I guess turned some of those principles into, well, given form to those principles, given software form, given actual structural form to some of those principles. Because in many ways, the way that something like YouTube operates has kind of formalised those systems and turned them into actual processes online, it seems to me. So that they no longer necessarily just exist at the level of social relations, but they exist at the level of actual, almost tangible algorithms, at the level of code. You know, the way that the YouTube site, for example, is built kind of gives form to those principles, it seems to me. So let me just go through and see if I can make any sense of that to the camera. And I should apologise, by the way, I've had a drink before I started, but never mind. Systems of influence. Okay. So what I want to suggest is that the idea of systems of influence exists on something like YouTube at the level of software. And I think it does. I mean, just things like, for example, the way that subscriptions work, or the way that friendships work, the way that people make contacts, the way that people can subtly or perhaps not so subtly influence one another's behaviours. For example, if you're watching this video on YouTube, you're probably seeing down the side here somewhere some other videos, recommended videos or related videos. Some of those will be mine, which might be kind of related to what I'm talking about here, but in all likelihood won't. But nevertheless, they're being brought into the frame, so they're forming part of the context of what, literal context, the literal environment in which you're watching this video, is being formed by the videos that I've made in the past, which may or may not be directly related to what I'm saying. But also, more crucially, probably a bit further down there somewhere, you'll be getting some related videos which are influenced by the tags I've put on here, but also about what you've watched in the past. Do you know what I mean? So what you have watched in the past is influencing the context of what you're watching in the present. So you and I together are forming this little bubble around ourselves, a bubble of context, a bubble of influence, which is kind of constraining and bounding the choices that are available to you about what you can click on next and what you can think about. It's not a rule, you know, I'm not telling you to do this, but it's just there as a kind of influential part of the algorithm, isn't it? There's a little system of influence built into the software. Similarly, systems of control. I mean, if you don't like this video, or then you can click on dislike, of course, and we'll get a little lightsaber forming underneath here, and that will affect other people's watching of this video, whether people watch it in a positive or a negative light. If you really dislike it and you think this shouldn't be allowed on the internet, you might even flag it. And videos have been flagged on YouTube for far less than what I'm doing right now. So there are systems of control which are in place at the level of software, which are affecting whether other people can watch this video, which is slightly odd. And then there is transcendent belief. You know, obviously I don't. We might agree together that we don't have transcendent beliefs, but at the level of the algorithm, there's a kind of belief going on, isn't there? There's a belief which is enshrined within the way that Google/YouTube operates, that what you're watching now is something that you like, and that you would also like to watch more stuff, a bit like the stuff you've watched in the past. Yes, that's why the related videos are the way they are. That's why, if, like me, you've occasionally watched Mock the Week on YouTube, you keep getting recommendations to watch more episodes of Mock the Week, or whatever it may be. So there's a kind of sense there that what you've watched in the past is the kind of thing that you would be entertained by in the future. That's a belief. That's a belief, a kind of belief in entertainment. and a belief in the consistency of our tastes, and a belief that we don't want to be changed, and a belief that that we should be rewarded by having more of the same stuff, and perhaps perhaps better stuff that's a bit like what we've watched before, but is more so. You know, so that's a set of beliefs, isn't it? Really, it's a belief about. Yeah, it's a belief about marketing, it's a belief about entertainment, it's a belief about what people want, and a belief about desire, but it's absolutely enshrined at the level of software, and it's constraining what you and I look at and what we think about. Elsewhere I've heard this described as a filter bubble. You know, the possibilities of what we look at next are constrained, are bounded. Our choices about what we look at next are bounded by the fact that we're placed in a filter bubble. And the things that we perhaps might not immediately want to look at, but possibly should be exposed to, are being filtered out before we even come within the orbit of our attention. So again, at the level of the software itself, at the level of algorithm, at the level of the way this site operates, there's a sense in which our choices are bounded in a way that's kind of cultish. You know, even before any kind of content emerges on the scene. Okay, so those three. We've got systems of influence, systems of control. We've got this kind of sense of transcendent belief, which is an overarching story, the story of entertainment, which is constraining and bounding our choice. And then this thing about charismatic authority. Now, again, on first fist of that one, it's not immediately obvious what charismatic authority we're talking about here, because I don't think I'm particularly charismatic, whatever that means, and I certainly don't have any authority. But there is something about this environment, isn't there, which does kind of confer that. We have low wattage celebrities, as I heard someone call it recently. Low wattage celebrities. The more people watch a video, the more people will watch it. Just attention itself becomes a kind of self-perpetuating charismatic engine. And there's quite a lot of evidence, by the way, to suggest that charisma, whatever that may mean, well, I know what it means, but however it operates, that charisma is a product not of an individual person's innate abilities, but it's a product of social relations. So we confer charisma on people if they behave in certain ways, or if other people have attributed charisma to them in the past, or other people have related to them in ways which suggest that they have some kind of authority. If we see people who are attracting attention, we also give them attention. And this is an attention engine, isn't it? I mean, that's how this whole site operates. That's the business model of this site, is to reward attention. That's why, I mean, there won't be any adverts here because I don't monetize my videos, but in many cases there will be adverts here. And the more charismatic, the more attention the person on this side of the camera can operate, the more the possibility that your attention will be steered to the advert, which is not over there. So again, right at the level of software, right at the level of the business model, in fact, for Google/YouTube, is this idea of charisma, of charismatic authority, that if I can persuade you to watch me for a few minutes, just long enough for you to subliminally understand that there's an advert next to me which is kind of interesting, maybe. If I can do that, then I have enough authority for you to reward that by contributing to my viewing figures, to possibly contributing my subscription numbers, to contributing this number of likes this get, which brings in more people, which again adds to those figures, and so charisma builds. And we can see a lot of kind of celebrities on YouTube who are absolutely a product of that kind of charisma engine in operation. The generation of charismatic authority by the algorithm of the system powering that business model. So in terms of Lalek's model of bounded choice, it seems to me that notwithstanding all of those kind of groups, those kind of vaguely cultish groups that we might talk about, you know, whether it be atheism plus, or whether it be antinatalism, whether it be dozens and dozens of others kind of self-perpetuating, self-defining groups that emerge, over and above any individual grouping that's doing that, there is something about sites like YouTube, sites like this, it's in their very operation, which contain, I think, at the level of the algorithm, at the level of coding, at the level of structure, these various systems which bound our choices, which create systems of control, systems of influence, which create transcendent beliefs, and which create charismatic authority, and which we align ourselves with, to the expense of other kinds of influence, to the expense of other kinds of possibilities. Anyway, thanks very much for your patience, a bit longer than I anticipated, and good night.